Hey guys, tonight we begin with a world that feels distant, yet strangely familiar. A world of stone castles, candlelit halls, and long roads lined with mud. This is medieval Europe, a place where love was rarely written into contracts, yet somehow still managed to exist in the spaces between duty and survival. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. In the Middle Ages, marriage was rarely about romance. For nobles, it was a political tool. For merchants, it was a business alliance. For peasants, it was often a matter of labor and survival. Land needed heirs. Families needed protection. Villages needed stability. A wedding was less about personal choice and more about agreements made by fathers, lords, and community elders. Yet even in this structured world, medieval people still fell in love, not through modern dating, but through rituals, secret traditions, and unexpected human moments that survived beneath the weight of obligation. To understand how medieval people fell in love, it helps to begin in the year 1179 in the northern French county of Champagne, one of the most economically active regions of Europe. Champagne was famous not only for its wine, but for its trade fairs. These fairs drew merchants from England, Italy, Spain, and the German states. It was one of the few places in medieval Europe where people of different classes, languages, and backgrounds crossed paths. In the town of Provence, stone walls surrounded narrow streets, and the air carried the sound of iron tools, market bargaining, and church bells. Life was ruled by seasons and religion. The church calendar shaped time itself. Saints' days, fasting periods, and festivals dictated when people worked, rested, and celebrated. It was within these festivals that something unusual happened. Medieval society, so strict in hierarchy, temporarily loosened. Music appeared in the streets. Food was shared publicly. Dances took place in village squares. And in those moments, young men and women saw one another beyond arranged expectations. A young scribe named Martin lived in Provence. He was not noble, but he was educated, which made him valuable. He copied contracts, recorded debts, and wrote letters for merchants who could not write themselves. His life was stable but controlled. His future marriage was already being discussed quietly between his uncle and a local wool trader. It would be practical. It would secure work. It would ensure stability. Across the town lived Isabel, the daughter of a minor knight. Her family owned little land, but they had a name, and names mattered deeply in feudal Europe. Isabel's marriage was being negotiated with a man twice her age, a widower with property. It was not cruelty by medieval standards, it was normal. Marriage was a transfer of alliances, not affection. In medieval Europe, love existed in a complicated space. The church promoted marriage as sacred, but also warned against uncontrolled desire. At the same time, aristocratic culture developed something called courtly love. Troubadours in southern France sang poems of devotion, often describing knights worshipping unreachable ladies. These songs were not about marriage, they were about longing, restraint, and admiration. Courtly love was partly literature, partly social performance, and it shaped how medieval people imagined romance, even when their real marriages were arranged. Martin first saw Isabel during the Feast of St. John, celebrated with bonfires in summer. Festivals like these were among the few socially acceptable moments for young people to gather publicly. Medieval court records show that many relationships began at fairs, dances, and church gatherings. Even under strict supervision, human connection formed naturally. Their interactions were limited. They could not simply meet freely. Medieval towns were filled with watchful eyes. Reputation was everything, especially for women of status. Yet medieval people developed subtle systems. Messages were passed through servants. Glances carried meaning. Small gifts like ribbons, prayer tokens, or flowers could signal interest without open scandal. In this era, written letters were rare among common people, but not impossible among educated clerks and nobles. Love letters did exist. Surviving medieval manuscripts contain examples of romantic correspondence, though often carefully worded. Martin, as a scribe, understood the power of writing. Isabel, as a knight's daughter, understood the danger of being too direct. Their connection grew through public spaces that medieval society allowed. Church was one of them. Contrary to modern assumptions, churches were not always silent. They were community centers. People met there, spoke there, and observed one another there. Religious life and social life were intertwined. Marriage negotiations continued in the background, but medieval life was not purely mechanical. People resisted quietly. Court records from medieval England and France show cases of couples eloping, refusing arranged matches, or seeking church annulments. Love did not always win, but it existed as a force that medieval society constantly tried to regulate. The most surprising truth is that medieval people were not strangers to romance. They expressed it differently. Love was shaped by duty, secrecy, and coded behavior. It was not modern individualism, but it was still human attachment. In Champagne, trade fairs brought another unusual element: outsiders. Foreign merchants brought stories of distant cities. Italian traders spoke of Venice and Florence, places where wealth created different marriage customs. These encounters exposed medieval people to alternative possibilities, even if only as imagination. Martin began to write poetry, inspired by troubadour traditions spreading northward. Poetry was one of the safest outlets for affection. It could be framed as art rather than confession. Isabel listened during gatherings where traveling performers recited verses. In aristocratic circles, romantic language often existed even when marriages remained political. By the winter of 1180, Isabel's engagement was nearly finalized. The widower offered land. Her father needed security. Martin's own practical match was also advancing. The medieval system moved like a machine, and personal desire was not meant to interfere. Yet medieval history contains countless moments where ordinary people disrupted the expected order. Love was not the foundation of marriage, but it was the shadow that followed it everywhere. In secret meetings, in whispered vows, in songs sung at night, medieval people found ways to experience attachment, even when society treated marriage as business. The story of Martin and Isabel was not unique, but it was shaped by the medieval world's contradictions, a society that preached sacred union yet arranged contracts, a culture that feared desire yet celebrated romantic poetry, a world where love was both restricted and endlessly imagined. And as the fairs returned and the church bells marked the passing seasons, their lives moved toward a decision that medieval people faced often: obedience to structure or the dangerous pursuit of personal devotion hidden beneath the surface of duty.
In the years that followed, the structure of medieval society remained firm, yet within it existed a network of subtle customs that allowed private attachment to grow beneath public obedience. Courtship in the Middle Ages was rarely a dramatic rebellion. It was usually quiet, coded, and woven carefully into daily routine. What appears rigid from a distance was, in practice, filled with small human negotiations. By the late 12th century, northern France had absorbed elements of courtly culture from the south. Troubadours had transformed into trouvères, composing in la langue d'oil rather than Occitan. Their verses circulated among noble households, shaping ideals of refined affection. Love was described as disciplined admiration. The knight served the lady not as a husband, but as a loyal devotee. This model allowed romance to exist symbolically, even when marriage contracts remained transactional. Isabel's household followed these aristocratic patterns. Even if her marriage was being negotiated for land and alliance, she was educated in manners that emphasized grace, modesty, and controlled expression. Noble daughters were trained to sew, to manage estates in their husband's absence, and to navigate social rituals. They were also exposed to poetry and music that elevated romantic devotion as a noble virtue. Martin, though not noble, occupied a rare position. Literacy in medieval Europe was limited, especially outside the clergy. As a scribe, he belonged to a small but growing urban class whose skills connected commerce, law, and administration. The expansion of trade fairs had increased the demand for written contracts, debt records, and correspondence. This literacy gave him access to ideas traveling across Europe. One of the most important aspects of medieval courtship was proximity within supervision. Young men and women were rarely alone, but they were not invisible to one another. Marketplaces, wells, and religious festivals functioned as carefully monitored meeting points. During harvest celebrations, communities worked collectively. These events created natural opportunities for observation and conversation without scandal. Historical court rolls from England and France reveal that many marriages, even among peasants, required mutual consent. Canon law, formalized in the 12th century, declared that marriage was valid only if both parties agreed. This legal principle was surprisingly progressive compared to assumptions of the era. Parents arranged matches, but the church insisted that forced marriage lacked spiritual legitimacy. This created a narrow but powerful space for resistance. Martin became aware of this legal nuance through clerical documents he copied. The Fourth Lateran Council in 1215 would later formalize many of these marital regulations, but even before that, church courts were already handling cases of disputed consent. Couples sometimes declared vows privately, without parental approval. If those vows could be proven, the church often recognized them. Secret betrothals were therefore one of medieval Europe's most surprising realities. Known as clandestine marriages, they involved a spoken exchange of consent, often in the present tense. No priest was technically required for validity under canon law at that time. Witnesses helped, but even without them, sworn statements could hold weight. These legal complexities shaped how love operated beneath arranged systems. In Provence, winter brought slower trade but intensified household activity. Indoors, under candlelight, embroidery and manuscript copying filled long evenings. Isabel's father entertained visiting nights, discussing alliances and regional politics. The county of Champagne remained strategically important, positioned between royal authority and independent noble power. Martin's uncle continued negotiating his practical marriage. Dowries were calculated carefully. In medieval Europe, a dowry was not simply a gift, it was a transfer of wealth that secured a woman's position and protected her if widowed. Widows held more autonomy than unmarried women. They could manage property, enter contracts, and sometimes refuse remarriage. This legal independence explains why Isabel's proposed match was a widower. His household required management and heirs. Meanwhile, coded gestures continued. A ribbon worn in a particular color, a prayer book passed discreetly, participation in the same pilgrimage group. Pilgrimages were another socially acceptable avenue for extended interaction. Groups traveled to shrines, sometimes for days. Though supervised, the journey itself created shared experience. In medieval thought, love was often divided into categories. There was caritas, spiritual love rooted in Christian teaching. There was amicia, friendship and loyalty. And there was amor, which could refer to romantic or even passionate attachment. The church encouraged spiritual union within marriage, but remained wary of uncontrolled desire. Sermons warned against lust, yet marriage manuals acknowledged affection as stabilizing. Martin's understanding of love was shaped by texts he encountered in scriptoria. Works like Andreas Capellanos's The Art of Courtly Love, written in the late 12th century, circulated among educated circles. The text outlined elaborate rules of love, some serious, some satirical. It reinforced the idea that love could exist outside marriage, though carefully idealized. For Isabel, love was less theoretical. It was bound to risk. A noblewoman's reputation determined her family standing. Gossip traveled faster than written letters. A single rumor could weaken a marriage negotiation. Therefore, restraint defined every interaction. Spring returned, and with it another trade fair. Italian merchants arrived with silk and spices. English traders brought wool. Jewish financiers, protected under certain charters, yet often vulnerable to political shifts, facilitated loans. Medieval towns were more economically complex than often assumed. Diversity existed, though constrained by hierarchy and periodic tension. During the fair, performances were staged publicly. Traveling musicians recited chansons describing distant crusades and loyal devotion. The Crusades themselves had reshaped European views of love and absence. Knights departing for the Holy Land left wives behind for years. Letters traveled slowly. Songs romanticized longing separated by war. Absence intensified idealization. Martin and Isabel found themselves part of a wider cultural current. Love, though not central to marriage contracts, occupied literature, song, and whispered conversation. It shaped aspiration even when constrained by land agreements. One evening during the fair, a public dance was organized near the town square. Such dances were structured, with circles and supervised movement. Physical contact was limited and formal, yet even these small gestures carried weight. Medieval court records showed disputes arising from dances that crossed social lines. The boundaries between classes were visible, but not always impermeable. Martin understood that any overt act could endanger Isabel's standing. Instead, he relied on symbolic communication. Poetry left anonymously where she would find it, references to shared observations, language drawn from scripture that allowed layered meaning without explicit declaration. At the same time, Isabel's engagement advanced. The widower visited with gifts, fine cloth, a small silver brooch. Dowry agreements were drafted. Witnesses recorded terms. Martin himself may have copied similar contracts for other families, aware of the inevitability that such documents represented. Yet the Church's doctrine of consent lingered quietly as an alternative path. Medieval Europe functioned on overlapping authorities: feudal lords, royal courts, and ecclesiastical courts. When these systems conflicted, individuals sometimes navigated between them strategically. Cases preserved in ecclesiastical archives reveal couples declaring mutual vows in private, then appealing to church courts when families objected. Some succeeded, others faced punishment or social exile. Outcomes depended heavily on evidence and local power dynamics. By midsummer, Isabel faced a narrowing timeline. Engagement ceremonies in noble circles formalized alliances publicly. Once announced, reversal brought embarrassment and potential conflict. The practical machine of medieval marriage accelerated once agreements were near completion. Martin's position remained fragile. As a townsman, he lacked noble title. Even with literacy and economic stability, social rank mattered. Medieval society was structured vertically. Movement between classes was rare, though not impossible. Wealthy merchants sometimes married into minor nobility, especially if the noble family faced financial strain.
Economic pressure in Champagne created subtle shifts. The costs of maintaining knightly status were rising. Armor,
Horses and feudal obligations strained small estates. Some lesser nobles increasingly relied on urban wealth. This economic reality offered narrow but real opportunity. The intersection of economic need, church law, and personal attachment formed the quiet battleground where medieval love unfolded. It was not a battlefield of dramatic rebellion, but of calculated decisions made within constraint. As harvest approached once more, Martin began gathering documentation about canon law cases concerning consent. Isabel observed the legal protections afforded to widows and women whose marriages were disputed. Neither acted impulsively. Medieval survival required patience. The surprising truth about love in the Middle Ages is not that it was absent, but that it adapted. It operated within contracts. It learned the language of theology. It hid within festivals and pilgrimages. It studied legal codes. It survived through endurance rather than spectacle. In Provence, under stone walls that had witnessed generations of arranged unions, two individuals quietly evaluated the systems surrounding them. Marriage remained business, land remained power, reputation remained currency. Yet beneath these foundations, attachment continued to grow, shaped by the very laws that sought to regulate it. And as summer light faded into autumn once more, the next step would require not only affection, but strategy within the layered authorities of medieval Europe.
Autumn settled over Champagne with a measured rhythm. Harvest carts rolled through the gates of Provins, wheat and barley stacked high, livestock counted carefully before winter. In medieval Europe, survival remained the central priority. Every household calculated provisions against the length of the cold season. Yet even within this constant negotiation with scarcity, marriage contracts continued to shape alliances for the coming year. Isabel's engagement moved toward formal announcement. Among the lesser nobility, betrothal ceremonies often took place before witnesses, sometimes inside a chapel or great hall. Rings were exchanged, though not always as elaborate as modern symbols. A spoken promise before family and local clergy carried binding weight. Martin observed these preparations from a distance. As a scribe, he had copied agreements that outlined precise financial expectations, the amount of land transferred, the goods included in the dowry chest, the conditions under which property would revert to the bride's family if she were widowed. Medieval marriage was deeply practical. It merged estates, consolidated fields, and secured heirs who would inherit obligations as much as privilege. Yet beneath these negotiations, another legal framework operated quietly. Church courts held jurisdiction over the sacrament of marriage. Unlike feudal contracts, which were enforced by lords and family alliances, marital validity ultimately rested on consent recognized by canon law. This distinction created tension. Families could arrange and negotiate, but they could not, in theory, force spiritual union without mutual agreement. By the late 12th century, ecclesiastical courts across France and England were recording cases involving disputed marriages. Surviving registers showed testimonies from women and men who claimed to have exchanged vows privately. Witnesses described overheard promises, shared cups of wine, or phrases spoken in the present tense, "I take you as my wife," or "I take you as my husband." These words mattered deeply. If spoken sincerely and proven,
They could override parental plans. Martin began quietly consulting clerical acquaintances connected to the local abbey. Monasteries served not only as religious centers, but as repositories of law and literacy. Canon lawyers were emerging as specialists, interpreting decrees issued from Rome. Gratian's Decretum, compiled in the 12th century, had systematized church law and clarified that consent, not ceremony alone, created marriage. Isabel, meanwhile, faced increasing surveillance. Noble households guarded reputations carefully. Female chastity was tied directly to family honor and inheritance legitimacy. Rumors could disrupt negotiations. Therefore, her movements narrowed. She attended Mass, supervised household tasks, and received approved visitors. Public festivals offered fewer opportunities for unscripted interaction as her betrothal neared completion. Winter approached with early frost. Provene's markets slowed, but religious observances intensified. Advent brought structured anticipation before Christmas. During this season, sermons frequently addressed marriage, morality, and obedience. Priests reminded congregations that unions should reflect divine order. Yet even these sermons acknowledged the necessity of mutual will. Martin understood that time was shortening. If Isabel's betrothal became publicly sealed, challenging it would require significant proof. Ecclesiastical courts demanded testimony, consistency, and sometimes oath helpers who would swear to a claimant's credibility. False claims risked penance or social exclusion. The medieval world was not devoid of rebellion, but it punished recklessness. Strategy mattered more than impulse. Therefore, any declaration between them would need precision. Words had to be exact. Timing had to align with witnesses capable of supporting the claim. At the same time, broader forces were reshaping Europe. Royal authority in France was strengthening under Philip II. Administrative systems were expanding. Written documentation increased. This growth in bureaucracy unintentionally empowered individuals who could navigate written law. Literacy, once confined largely to clergy, was slowly spreading among urban professionals. In late December, Provenes prepared for Christmas celebrations. Feasting followed weeks of restraint. Even noble households relaxed somewhat during the 12 days of Christmas. Visitors traveled between estates. Hospitality extended generously, and formal negotiations paused temporarily. During this period, Martin secured a role assisting a visiting cleric who specialized in marital cases. The cleric had been traveling between towns, resolving disputes involving inheritance and contested vows. Such specialists were increasingly common as canon law matured. From copied records, Martin learned of a recent case in Normandy where a young woman successfully argued that she had exchanged present-tense vows with a man chosen against her father's wishes. Witnesses testified to hearing the words spoken near a village well. The church upheld the union despite family opposition. The ruling emphasized that marriage was formed by consent alone. This precedent carried weight. However, enforcement heavily depended on local bishops and political context. Noble families possessed influence. Challenging them required not only legal validity, but protection. In early January, Isabel's betrothal feast was scheduled for spring. Winter months would finalize dowry arrangements. Once publicly celebrated, reversing the process would become increasingly complex. Medieval society valued order, yet it was layered with competing jurisdictions. Feudal custom prioritized lineage and land. Canon law prioritized sacramental integrity. Royal courts prioritized stability. Individuals navigating these systems required careful calculation. One evening, Under the cover of communal prayer at a small chapel outside the main town walls, Martin and Isabel spoke with deliberate clarity. No dramatic gesture occurred, no raised voices. Instead, precise words were chosen carefully, reflecting language found in canon texts. They declared mutual acceptance in the present tense, witnessed by two trusted individuals connected to the abbey, who understood the significance of the phrasing. Such clandestine vows were not rare in medieval Europe. Historians have documented numerous examples across England, France, and Italy. The Church tolerated them reluctantly, eventually attempting to regulate them more strictly because of the social chaos they sometimes caused. Yet in this period, they remained legally binding if proven sincere. The risk was immediate. If discovered prematurely, Isabel's family could confine her, dispute her credibility, or pressure witnesses. Therefore, silence followed. Documentation was discreetly recorded by the visiting cleric, who retained a copy in his travel chest.
Weeks passed without outward change. Preparations for the spring betrothal continued publicly. Yet beneath the surface, a parallel legal reality existed. If Isabel's family proceeded, she could present her claim before an ecclesiastical court, asserting prior valid consent. This strategy required courage measured not in dramatic defiance, but in endurance. Medieval litigation moved slowly. Testimonies were examined carefully. Oaths were taken upon relics. False swearing carried spiritual consequences, believed to extend beyond death. By February, rumors reached Isabel's father that she appeared withdrawn. Concern focused less on romance and more on obedience. Noble daughters were expected to demonstrate willingness. Resistance could be interpreted as instability. At the same time, economic pressures tightened. The widower's estate faced minor deaths after a poor harvest year. His interest in the alliance intensified. Financial interdependence magnified urgency. In March, as roads thawed and merchants returned for the first fair of the year, the betrothal feast commenced. Nobles gathered in Provins' great hall. Gifts were displayed. Wine poured freely. Witnesses assembled to observe the formal promise. It was at this moment, before vows were finalized publicly, that Isabel invoked ecclesiastical protection. Accompanied by the visiting cleric and her two witnesses, she declared that she had already entered into valid marriage through present-tense consent months prior. The hall did not erupt in chaos. Medieval disputes rarely resembled theatrical scenes. Instead, tension manifested in formal objection. Her father denied knowledge. The widower questioned legitimacy. The cleric calmly cited canon law. Under church authority, the matter required investigation. The betrothal ceremony halted. A hearing was scheduled before the bishop's representative. Until resolution, no further contract could proceed without risking invalidity. For the townspeople of Provins, this was not merely personal drama. It illustrated the growing power of ecclesiastical courts over noble arrangements. The Church's insistence on consent introduced an element of unpredictability into marriage as business. Testimony followed over several weeks. Witnesses affirmed the spoken vows. The cleric presented written notes, dated and sealed. Isabel repeated her declaration consistently. Martin confirmed mutual consent without hesitation. Ultimately, the church court recognized the prior exchange as valid marriage. The ruling did not erase social tension. Isabel's family faced embarrassment. The widower lost a strategic alliance.
yet canon law prevailed. The surprising reality of medieval love is not that it overthrew systems dramatically, but that it maneuvered within them using the tools those systems provided. Consent doctrine, literacy, and clerical procedure created narrow corridors through which personal attachment could assert legitimacy. Martin and Isabel's union did not transform medieval Europe. Land remained central, alliances remained strategic, yet their marriage stood not as rebellion against medieval order, but as evidence of its internal complexity. In the months that followed, economic negotiations resumed in altered form. Isabel's dowry adjusted to reflect the new arrangement. Martin's literacy secured modest advancement within urban administration. Social rank did not equalize entirely, but compromise emerged. Medieval society continued forward, structured yet flexible in unexpected ways. Love, constrained by contract and hierarchy, persisted through legal nuance rather than emotional spectacle. And as the bells of Provence marked another passing season, their marriage became part of the very system that once threatened to prevent it, demonstrating that even in an age dominated by business alliances, personal consent could quietly reshape destiny. The months after the church court's decision unfolded with careful adjustment rather than celebration. Medieval Europe rarely offered clean resolutions. Social order depended on stability, and any disruption required repair through negotiation. Isabel's family accepted the ruling outwardly, though privately their position had been weakened. The widower withdrew with resentment, but he could not openly challenge ecclesiastical authority without risking his own standing. Martin and Isabel's marriage was now valid under canon law, yet legitimacy in medieval society was layered. A church court could declare a union lawful, but noble households measured alliances through power and reputation. Isabel's father shifted strategy quickly, framing the marriage not as defiance, but as a spiritually guided outcome, emphasizing Martin's education and usefulness within the growing administrative world. This was one of the great transformations of the High Middle Ages. Literacy and bureaucracy were slowly reshaping social structures. Towns were expanding. Royal governments needed clerks, record keepers, and legal specialists. The old feudal hierarchy remained dominant, but cracks appeared where skill and commerce created alternative forms of influence. Martin's role as a scribe became more significant. The county of Champagne relied on written records to manage fair taxation, tolls, and dispute resolution. Merchants required contracts enforceable across regions. Written law became an instrument of power. In this environment, a literate townsman could rise modestly, especially if connected through marriage to minor nobility. Isabel entered a different kind of life than she had been prepared for. As a noblewoman, she was trained for estate management and alliance building. Now she navigated the urban world of Provence, where merchants held influence and wealth circulated more fluidly. Her noble background still mattered, but the rhythms of town life differed from those of rural estates. Medieval love, even when it succeeded, rarely produced romantic leisure. Marriage quickly became labor. Households required management. Children were expected. Economic survival remained constant. Yet the very fact that Isabel and Martin's union had been chosen through consent rather than pure arrangement placed them in an unusual position for their era. Their story, however, did not exist in isolation. The wider medieval world was shaped by one of its defining forces, crusading. By the late 12th century, Crusades were no longer singular expeditions, but recurring phenomena. The First Crusade had captured Jerusalem in 1099, creating crusader states in the Levant. Subsequent crusades attempted to defend or reclaim territory, drawing thousands of European knights eastward. Crusading became entwined with aristocratic identity, spiritual obligation, and political ambition. Champagne itself was deeply connected to crusading culture. Count Henry II of Champagne would travel to the Holy Land and eventually become king of Jerusalem through marriage. Noble families across the region viewed crusading as both piety and opportunity. This environment shaped how medieval people experienced love and marriage. Crusades separated couples for years. Knights departed, leaving wives to manage estates. Letters traveled slowly across continents. Songs and chronicles romanticized devotion sustained through distance. For Isabel, crusading was part of her noble heritage. For Martin, it was a distant political reality until it entered their household directly. In 1187, news spread across Europe of Jerusalem's fall to Saladin. The shock triggered the Third Crusade, led by figures such as Richard the Lionheart of England and Philip II of France. Preachers traveled through towns calling nobles to take the cross. The crusade became a matter of prestige and faith. In Provence, sermons intensified. Recruitment was not limited to great lords. Lesser knights joined, seeking honor or redemption. Some townsmen participated as well, though the cost was immense. Funding a crusade required selling land, mortgaging estates, or borrowing from financiers. One of Isabel's relatives, a young knight named Gerard, announced his intention to join the expedition. His departure would affect family resources. Isabel's father, eager to restore honor after the marriage controversy, supported Gerard's crusading vow. Participation could elevate family standing. Before leaving, Gerard visited Isabel and Martin. He spoke not in dramatic terms, but in measured language of duty. Crusading was framed as service to God and family. Yet beneath the rhetoric lay practical consequences. Gerard needed funds. He requested assistance securing loans through merchant networks. Here, Martin's position became crucial. As a scribe connected to merchants, he could facilitate contracts. Crusading created financial systems of remarkable complexity. Knights often pawned estates temporarily, granting lenders rights to revenue until repayment. Monastic orders like the Templars also served as financial intermediaries, offering secure transfer of funds across regions. Martin drafted documents ensuring that Gerard's lands would support his household while he was away. Isabel witnessed how crusading intertwined with economics as much as spirituality. For medieval couples, crusades introduced a new dimension of love, endurance through absence. Many wives became de facto estate managers. Widows often remarried, but some chose to remain independent. Letters from crusaders survive, though rare, showing concern for households left behind. In the urban world, merchants also traveled extensively. Trade routes connected Champagne to Italy, the Mediterranean, and beyond. Distance became a common feature of medieval life, shaping attachment differently from static village existence. Martin's work expanded. Merchants needed correspondence drafted in Latin and vernacular. The fairs grew increasingly international. Provence became a node in a network stretching from London to Genoa. Isabel, educated in noble administration, applied her skills within this urban context. She supervised servants, managed household accounts, and hosted visitors whose conversations ranged from trade disputes to crusade rumors. Medieval love in such circumstances was expressed through loyalty and partnership rather than open sentiment. Marriage functioned as cooperation. The eagle idealized conjugal unity as spiritual support. Practical survival required mutual reliance.
In 1191, word arrived of Richard the Lionheart's victories at Acre. Songs spread across Europe celebrating Crusader heroism. Trouvères composed verses not only about battle, but about longing for home. The culture of courtly love merged with crusading ideology, producing an image of the absent knight devoted to a lady waiting faithfully. Isabel recognized these narratives, yet her reality differed. Her marriage was not a distant poetic ideal, but a daily partnership shaped by law, economics, and social navigation. One winter evening, a messenger arrived from Gerard. His letter, written with Martin's assistance before departure, described harsh conditions, disease, and uncertainty. Crusading was brutal, far removed from romanticized songs. Many never returned. This harshness revealed another truth about medieval love. It existed alongside constant mortality. Disease, war, childbirth, and famine made life fragile. Marriage was not only alliance, but insurance against loneliness and vulnerability. When Gerard failed to return after several years, Isabel's family faced loss. Crusading glory did not guarantee survival. Estates could fall into debt. Widows and heirs struggled with contested claims. Martin's literacy again proved valuable. He helped Isabel's father resolve inheritance disputes, navigating both feudal custom and church oversight. Through these legal processes, Martin gained respect not as a romantic outsider, but as a necessary administrator. The marriage that began as controversial became integrated into family strategy. Isabel's father leveraged Martin's skills to stabilize resources weakened by crusading expenses. This pattern reflected broader medieval transformation. The old warrior nobility increasingly depended on educated administrators. Townsmen rose in influence. Love, when it aligned with emerging economic realities, could reshape social boundaries. By the late 1190s, Martin and Isabel's household had children. Heirs mattered deeply. Children secured lineage and property continuity. Medieval parenthood carried high risk, yet it anchored marriage firmly within social expectation. Their union, once contested, now produced stability. The church recognized it. The town benefited from Martin's work. Isabel's noble blood provided connection to aristocratic networks. The marriage became, ironically, both personal and practical. Medieval love did not overthrow business marriage. Instead, it sometimes entered it, transforming contract into partnership. The surprising element was not romance alone, but the way legal doctrine, economic change, and cultural ideals created spaces where consent could matter. As the century turned, Provins continued to thrive, its fairs drawing merchants and stories from across the world. Crusading remained a force, shaping absence and return, loss and inheritance. And within this evolving medieval landscape, Martin and Isabel's story demonstrated that even in an age where marriage was largely business, love survived through law, strategy, endurance,
and the quiet persistence of human choice. As the 13th century approached, the world around Provins continued to shift in ways that medieval people could sense but not fully name. Trade expanded, royal authority strengthened, the church tightened regulation over practices that had once existed in ambiguous space. The very legal loophole that had allowed Martin and Isabel's marriage to stand would soon be targeted for reform. In 1215, the Fourth Lateran Council convened in Rome under Pope Innocent III, one of the most powerful pontiffs of the Middle Ages. This council issued sweeping decrees shaping doctrine, discipline, and everyday life across Christendom. Among its many reforms was a direct attempt to control clandestine marriages. The Church had long insisted that consent created marriage, but secret unions created instability. Families disputed inheritance, individuals made false claims, social order fractured. Therefore, the council required that marriages be publicly announced by bans, proclaimed in church before the wedding. Priests were instructed to ensure unions were witnessed and recorded. The medieval church sought to reduce the private, hidden marriages that had once been legally possible. Martin, now older and more established, understood the significance immediately. The world that had allowed him and Isabel to maneuver quietly was closing. Future couples would face stricter oversight. Love would not disappear, but the pathways would narrow. Provins itself was also changing. The Champagne fairs, once unrivaled, began facing competition from other trade centers. Italian city-states grew stronger. New routes developed. Economic gravity slowly shifted southward. Towns that thrived in the 12th century faced new pressures in the 13th. Martin's household remained stable, yet medieval stability was never permanent. Political conflict between French kings and regional nobles continued. Taxation increased. Lords sought revenue from towns. Merchants negotiated charters to protect their privileges. Isabel's noble relatives, weakened by crusading losses, depended increasingly on urban alliances. The marriage that had once embarrassed her father now appeared almost prophetic, bridging noble lineage with administrative skill. Yet the most surprising twist in their story came not from romance, but from the medieval world's constant unpredictability: inheritance. In 1221, Isabel's father died unexpectedly during a regional outbreak of fever. Sudden death was common. Medicine remained limited. The household entered mourning rituals dictated by custom and church practice. But beneath grief lay immediate legal reality. Land and rights required transfer. Isabel, as a daughter, was not automatically excluded from inheritance, but medieval property law was complex. In many regions, sons held priority, yet daughters could inherit if no male heir existed, or if specific agreements were made. Isabel's father had no surviving sons. Gerard had never returned. The line was fragile. This created a dangerous opportunity. Distant male cousins appeared, claiming the estate under feudal custom. They argued that Isabel's marriage to a townsman weakened her right to transmit noble land. They framed Martin as an outsider, unworthy of feudal authority. The dispute moved quickly beyond family argument into formal litigation. Feudal courts became involved. The king's representatives watched closely, as disputed estates often allowed royal expansion of control. The church observed as well, since inheritance disputes often intersected with marriage legitimacy. Martin faced the greatest test of his life. His literacy and legal knowledge had helped him win Isabel's hand. Now it was required to defend her birthright. He gathered charters, contracts, and ecclesiastical rulings. He demonstrated that their marriage was valid, that Isabel remained noble by blood, and that her inheritance rights were recognized under existing agreements. He appealed not only to feudal custom, but to written documentation, increasingly valued in the growing bureaucratic age. The cousins relied on older assumptions, that nobility was guarded through marriage alliances, that townsmen could not hold feudal land, that social hierarchy was immovable. The court case became a symbol of medieval transition. The old world of unwritten lineage claims confronted the new world of documents, clerks, and centralized authority. Witnesses testified. Priests confirmed Isabel's legitimacy. Merchants spoke of Martin's standing in Provence. The cousins attempted to undermine him through insult rather than evidence, but insult held less weight in written proceedings than it once had. After months of hearings, a compromise emerged. Isabel retained rights to portions of the estate, while certain lands reverted to male kin under feudal expectation. Martin gained administrative oversight, but not full noble title. The outcome reflected medieval reality, partial change, rather than total transformation. Yet even this partial victory carried significance. Isabel's inheritance secured their children's future. It elevated the household beyond urban life into a hybrid position between town and nobility. The shocking element was not dramatic romance, but structural. Love had not only survived medieval marriage business, it had inserted itself into the mechanisms of power. Their marriage began as a private act of consent against arrangement. It became a legally recognized union. It then reshaped inheritance, property, and social alignment. What started as personal attachment ended as political consequence. By the mid-13th century, Martin's sons entered clerical schools. Education became the new pathway of influence. One served in a bishop's administration, another worked for a royal tax office. The family's trajectory illustrated a broader European shift. Governance increasingly depended on literate professionals rather than purely warrior elites. Isabel, once a noble daughter expected to marry for alliance, became the bridge between feudal lineage and urban administration. Her life demonstrated that medieval women, though constrained, could exert agency through law, inheritance, and consent. In the end, medieval people fell in love not through modern freedom, but through the narrow spaces left open by competing authorities. They loved through festivals, poetry, secret vows, and legal doctrine. They loved within contracts, not outside society, but inside its contradictions. Marriage remained business for most. Alliances remained central. Yet love persisted, not as a fantasy, but as a force that could quietly redirect outcomes. Provence continued to ring with church bells, merchants continued to travel, and the medieval world continued forward, layered with obligation and choice. And within that world, Martin and Isabel's story remained a testament to the surprising truth of the Middle Ages. Even when marriage was largely business, human consent still carried power, and love, shaped by law and endurance, could leave an imprint on history. By the middle of the 13th century, the world Martin and Isabel had first known in their youth no longer existed in the same form. The stone walls of Provence still stood, the fairs still functioned, and the bells still marked the canonical hours. But authority had consolidated, records had multiplied, and the church had tightened its supervision over private life. Medieval Europe was becoming more regulated, more documented, and more interconnected. Martin, now gray-haired and deliberate in movement, spent much of his time reviewing charters and managing correspondence, tied to both town administration and the fragments of land secured through Isabel's inheritance. What had once been a risky marriage built on whispered consent had matured into a stable partnership that influenced two social spheres. Their household stood as quiet evidence of transition, nobility by blood, urban by profession, protected by documentation. Yet the evolution of medieval marriage law did not stop with the Fourth Lateran Council. Parish priests were now required to announce marriages publicly on 3 consecutive Sundays before the ceremony. These bans were designed to prevent secret unions and ensure that any impediment, prior vows, kinship within forbidden degrees, or existing marriage could be revealed. The Church sought order, transparency, and traceable legitimacy. Ironically, Martin sometimes assisted in recording these very announcements. Young couples who might once have followed the path he and Isabel took were now required to marry openly under clerical supervision. Love had not disappeared, but it was increasingly channeled into structured ceremony. The younger generation in Provence approached marriage differently than their parents. Town populations had grown. Craft guilds were emerging with more defined authority. Apprenticeship systems regulated who could enter trades, and guild membership often influenced marriage prospects. A blacksmith's daughter might marry within the craft network to preserve business continuity. A merchant's son might seek alliance with another trading family to expand roots. Economic logic remained central, but something subtle had changed. The idea that mutual affection strengthened marriage was becoming more widely accepted. Sermons in the 13th century began emphasizing companionship alongside procreation. Theologians like Thomas Aquinas described marriage as ordered toward both offspring and mutual support. The language of partnership, though still structured within hierarchy, gained legitimacy. Isabel observed these shifts while advising younger women in both noble and urban circles. She did not openly recount the legal intricacies of her own early struggle, but her existence as a respected wife who had once defied arrangement quietly influenced perception. Stories traveled even when unspoken directly. Beyond Provence, Europe faced new pressures. The Albigensian Crusade in southern France had demonstrated that crusading zeal could be turned inward against perceived heresy. Religious conformity tightened. The Inquisition emerged as a formal institution to investigate doctrinal deviation. Marriage cases increasingly fell under stricter scrutiny, especially where clandestine vows created confusion. Martin's eldest son, Etienne, entered ecclesiastical administration and witnessed these investigations firsthand. Church courts examined claims of invalid consent, coercion, or undisclosed kinship. Documentation became essential. Oral testimony remained important, but written records now carried greater authority than in Martin's youth. The family's social standing continued to evolve. While they never achieved high nobility, their hybrid identity offered resilience. They could navigate merchant contracts and feudal customs alike. Isabel's inherited lands, though partially reduced through compromise, produced modest income. Urban investments through trade supplemented agricultural revenue. Yet medieval life remained unstable. In the 1230s, regional crop failures affected parts of northern France. Grain prices rose sharply. Urban poor struggled. Famine did not destroy Provence, but it strained households. Marriage during hardship became even more practical. Families sought alliances that secured food access and economic stability. Love in such conditions required endurance more than poetry. Couples faced survival decisions together. Shared labor strengthened bonds as much as romantic language ever had. The emotional expression familiar to modern audiences remains subdued in written sources, but partnership was visible in action. As decades passed, Martin and Isabel's children married. These marriages reflected both pragmatism and measured consent. No union occurred without discussion between the couple. The precedent of mutual agreement had become normalized in their household. Business considerations remained present, but they did not erase personal voice. The greatest transformation came unexpectedly from outside Europe. In the 1240s, reports spread of Mongol incursions into Eastern Europe. Though distant from Champagne, these rumors reinforced awareness of a broader world beyond familiar trade routes. The medieval mindset, once centered tightly on local and regional hierarchy, gradually expanded through trade, crusade, and rumor. By the 1250s, Provence's dominance in trade began declining more noticeably. Italian banking families developed advanced credit systems. Sea routes grew more efficient. Economic centers shifted. Adaptation became necessary. Martin's younger son pursued work in Paris, where the university had become a center of intellectual life. Universities represented another medieval innovation. Students studied theology, law, medicine, and philosophy. Marriage doctrine continued to be debated and refined within these academic settings. The family's narrative, once rooted in a small-town court dispute, now extended into emerging institutions shaping Europe's future. In their later years, Martin and Isabel spent more time on the inherited rural lands. The estate was modest but stable. Serfs worked fields under obligations that were gradually softening as monetary rents substituted some labor dues. Feudalism itself was slowly transforming. They observed younger couples marrying with public bans, priestly blessings, and recorded entries in parish registers. Secret vows still occurred occasionally, but enforcement had tightened. The church had succeeded in narrowing the loophole that once enabled their union. Yet the deeper reality remained unchanged. Consent still defined marriage at its core. The church had not removed that principle. It had only regulated how it was expressed. Love remained legitimate when framed within approved structure. The final years of their lives were marked not by dramatic events, but by continuity. Grandchildren played in courtyards that had once witnessed whispered exchanges. Documents they preserved were copied by new scribes. Legal habits they practiced became routine for the next generation. When Martin died, his burial followed established rites. Isabel survived him for several years, managing property with the competence she had demonstrated throughout her life. Widowhood in medieval Europe could bring autonomy. She oversaw harvest accounts and corresponded with her sons confidently. Her life traced the arc of medieval marriage transformation, from arranged expectation to contested consent, from private vow to public legitimacy, from scandal to integration. By the time Isabel herself was buried beside Martin, Europe had entered a more centralized and documented era. Marriage was still business in many ways. Dowries, inheritance, and alliance remained critical. Yet the recognition of individual consent had become deeply embedded in canon law and social expectation. The astonishing truth of medieval love was not its rebellion against structure, but its survival within it. Love did not dismantle hierarchy. It learned its language. It studied its rules. It used its courts. It endured its wars, famines, and reforms. And long after their names faded from memory, the legal and cultural shifts they navigated continued shaping European marriage for centuries, influencing concepts of consent and partnership that would eventually echo far beyond the stone walls of Provence into the modern world that inherited both the business of marriage and the persistent human desire to choose.
As the 13th century progressed,
The medieval world entered a phase of consolidation. Kings expanded administrative reach. The church refined discipline. Towns grew more regulated through guilds and charters. The spaces where individuals once moved quietly between competing authorities narrowed further. Yet the principles that had shaped Martin and Isabel's union continued to spread across Europe. Their children now belonged fully to this new era. They were not the generation of whispered vows beneath uncertain law, but the generation of recorded bans, parish oversight, and written legitimacy. Marriage remained intertwined with economics, yet it was increasingly framed as a public institution rather than a private arrangement. In Provins, guild structures strengthened. Bakers, weavers, tanners, and metalworkers formed associations that controlled training, pricing, and membership. These guilds influenced marriage patterns. Families sought unions that preserved craft continuity. A master artisan's daughter might marry an apprentice rising within the same guild. Marriage served business, but it also served community stability. At the same time, noble households continued to negotiate alliances through marriage, though the economic realities of maintaining knightly status grew harsher. Armor, horses, and obligations required cash more than land alone could provide. Many lesser nobles entered debt. This financial pressure pushed aristocrats toward urban wealth. Thus, marriages between minor nobility and wealthy townsmen became more common. What had been controversial in Isabel's youth became increasingly pragmatic. Social boundaries remained strong, but necessity softened them. The church's influence over marriage deepened. Parish priests became gatekeepers of legitimacy. Marriage registers began appearing in some regions, recording unions more systematically. The sacrament was now firmly embedded in public ritual. Yet medieval love did not disappear into bureaucracy. Instead, it adapted. Courtly ideals persisted in literature. Trouvères continued composing songs of devotion. Romances, such as those of Chrétien de Troyes, shaped aristocratic imagination, describing knights driven by loyalty, honor, and restrained affection. These stories were not manuals for daily life, but they mattered culturally. They offered symbolic space where love could be imagined beyond contract. Even arranged marriages existed within a society that increasingly valued the concept of companionship, at least rhetorically. Martin and Isabel's grandchildren grew up hearing such tales. They lived in a world where love was not the primary foundation of marriage, but neither was it irrelevant. The idea that affection strengthened household unity was becoming part of accepted discourse. The wider medieval world, however, remained volatile. In the 1290s, France expelled its Jewish population, seizing assets and disrupting financial networks. Such expulsions had occurred before, but the scale reflected growing royal centralization and fiscal ambition. Town economies were shaken, credit systems shifted, merchants adapted quickly, but instability remained. Provins, once a thriving node of international fairs, faced gradual decline as trade routes favored maritime centers. Genoa, Venice, and Bruges gained prominence. Champagne's fairs did not vanish overnight, but their dominance weakened. For families like Martin and Isabel's descendants, adaptation meant diversification. Some remained in town administration, others moved toward Paris, where royal government and intellectual life offered opportunity. The rise of Paris as a political and intellectual center reflected the new medieval order, centralized, literate, and increasingly bureaucratic. Marriage strategies evolved accordingly. Urban professionals married into networks tied to royal offices. Nobility sought connections that provided access to cash and administration rather than purely land. In the early 14th century, Europe entered a period of mounting strain. Climate patterns shifted into what historians later called the beginning of the Little Ice Age. Harvests became less predictable. The Great Famine of 1315 to 1317 struck northern Europe severely, killing millions through starvation and disease. In such crisis, marriage became even more practical. Households formed alliances for survival. Dowries shrank. Delayed marriages increased as resources tightened. Love persisted, but necessity dominated. The descendants of Martin and Isabel faced these hardships with the resilience of a family experienced in navigating change. Their hybrid position, part noble lineage, part urban professionalism, offered flexibility. They could draw income from land and from administrative work. Yet no preparation could shield Europe from what came next. In 1347, ships arrived in Mediterranean ports carrying plague. Within months, the Black Death spread across Europe. By 1348, it reached France. Towns emptied, villages collapsed, clergy died in large numbers. The social fabric fractured under mortality unprecedented in scale. Provins was not spared. Parish registers, where they existed, show abrupt spikes in burials. Entire households vanished. Labor shortages followed, weakening feudal obligations as surviving peasants demanded wages and mobility. The Black Death reshaped marriage profoundly. With death everywhere, inheritance disputes multiplied. Widows and widowers remarried quickly for stability. Social mobility increased as labor became scarce. The rigid medieval hierarchy loosened under demographic collapse. For the first time in centuries, ordinary people gained leverage. Serfs escaped obligations. Town workers demanded higher pay. Marriage choices expanded slightly because economic necessity shifted power balances. In this transformed world, the legacy of consent became even more important. Church courts continued to insist on mutual agreement, but now communities, weakened by loss, relied on households rebuilding quickly. Romantic ideals did not dominate, but partnership gained urgency. Marriage was survival, comfort, and continuity in a world haunted by mortality. Martin and Isabel's story, though distant by then, represented a thread in this larger evolution. Their union had demonstrated the power of consent within medieval law. Over generations, that principle endured, shaping expectations even as catastrophe reshaped society. By the late 14th century, Europe was no longer the world of 12th century champagne fairs. Feudalism weakened, royal states strengthened, towns expanded. The church faced criticism as its authority was tested by crisis. Marriage remained economic, yet the lived experience of love and partnership had shifted. Couples increasingly shared labor in rebuilding. Widows managed property. Men and women navigated new opportunities created by demographic upheaval. The astonishing reality of medieval love is that it was never static. It adapted through crusades, reforms, inheritance battles, famines, and plague. It survived not as modern romance, but as a persistent human capacity to form bonds within constraint. And as Europe moved slowly toward the Renaissance, the medieval foundations of consent, partnership, and household cooperation remained, shaping the future long after the stone streets of Provins had lost their central place in the world's commerce. By the 15th century, Europe had entered a world that still carried medieval structures, but was no longer fully medieval in the older sense. The Black Death had permanently altered demographics, economies, and social hierarchies. Labor shortages weakened the strictest forms of serfdom. Towns expanded their influence. Kings strengthened centralized authority. The church remained powerful, yet it faced growing criticism and internal strain. Marriage, across these changes, continued to serve practical purposes. Property, inheritance, and alliance still shaped unions at every level of society. Yet the experience of marriage and love had become more varied. The catastrophic mortality of the plague had forced households to rebuild repeatedly, creating new social flexibility. In northern France, Provins was no longer the dominant commercial hub it once had been. The champagne fairs had declined significantly as maritime trade and larger urban centers overtook inland routes. Yet Provins remained inhabited, its walls still enclosing streets where generations continued daily life. The descendants of Martin and Isabel were now several generations removed from the original marriage controversy. Their family had blended into the broader urban administrative class. Some served in royal offices, others managed landholdings that had survived inheritance disputes. Their noble bloodline mattered less than their literacy and connections. This reflected one of the most important long-term outcomes of the High Middle Ages, the rise of professional bureaucracies. Kings required clerks, courts required lawyers, towns required record keepers. Written documentation governed more aspects of life than ever before. Marriage law also continued to evolve. The insistence on public ceremony became increasingly enforced. Parish priests recorded unions more systematically. Marriage was now firmly embedded as both sacrament and public institution. Secret marriages still occurred, but they were increasingly treated as problematic exceptions rather than common legal realities. At the same time, cultural attitudes toward love were shifting through literature. The late medieval period produced romances that emphasized personal devotion more openly. Works such as the Roman de la Rose explored themes of love, desire, and social expectation. These texts shaped imagination, particularly among the educated classes. Love was still not the foundation of most marriages, but the language of affection became more present in discourse. Letters between spouses, especially among merchants and nobles, sometimes expressed partnership and care. Surviving correspondence from late medieval Italy and England revealed that some couples did develop emotional bonds within arranged frameworks. The 15th century also brought prolonged warfare. The Hundred Years' War between England and France, lasting from 1337 to 1453, devastated regions of France repeatedly. Armies moved through countryside, burning villages, seizing supplies, and displacing populations. War created instability that affected marriage patterns. In wartime, marriages could be delayed, accelerated, or reshaped by necessity. Noble alliances became even more strategic. Town families sought security through connections to military suppliers or royal administration. Widows and orphans increased in number. For ordinary people, war meant disruption of household continuity, yet it also meant opportunities for social mobility in the chaos of shifting power. Soldiers returned with loot or wounds. Some never returned. Marriage remained a framework for rebuilding. Joan of Arc's emergence in the 1420s symbolized the intensity of this era. Though not directly connected to Provence, her story reflected the deep intertwining of religion, war, and identity in late medieval France. In such an environment, love often appeared less in poetic idealization and more in household endurance. Couples relied on one another to survive instability. Marriage served as a practical unit of labor and defense. Yet something else was happening quietly beneath these conflicts: the gradual emergence of individualism. This did not mean modern freedom, but it meant that personal choice began to hold slightly more cultural weight, especially in towns. Urban life allowed young people more interaction than rural feudal estates. Apprentices lived in masters' households, mixing with other families. Markets remained meeting spaces. Festivals continued. The church still regulated sexuality strictly, but enforcement varied by locality. Court records from the 15th century show ongoing disputes over broken promises of marriage. These cases revealed that personal attachment and expectation carried recognized value. This legal development traced back to the medieval doctrine of consent that Martin and Isabel had once used. Consent remained central, but now promises and reputations became part of public litigation. By the late 15th century, printing technology emerged. Gutenberg's press, developed around 1450, transformed Europe's relationship with text. Literacy slowly expanded beyond clerical and administrative elites. Books circulated more widely. Religious instruction, romances, and moral guides reached new audiences. This expansion of reading material influenced concepts of love and marriage. People encountered stories of romance more frequently. Ideals spread beyond aristocratic courts into broader society. Marriage remained business, but cultural imagination increasingly included companionship as desirable. The gap between contract and affection narrowed slightly in discourse, even if economic realities persisted. In the early 15th century, Europe approached another transformation, the Reformation. Criticism of church authority grew. Debates over marriage, clerical celibacy, and sacramental control intensified. Protestant reformers would later reject marriage as a sacrament, redefining it as a social contract overseen by secular authority. This would reshape marriage profoundly. But even before the Reformation, late medieval Europe was already questioning old frameworks. The long arc from Martin and Isabel's clandestine vows to the regulated marriages of the 15th century revealed the adaptability of love within structure. Medieval people fell in love through coded rituals, legal nuance, partnership, and endurance. Marriage was largely business, yet human attachment persisted, influencing law, inheritance, and cultural ideals over centuries. By the time Europe entered the modern era, marriage would continue evolving, but the medieval foundation remained. Consent mattered, households mattered, and love, though constrained, had always existed inside the systems designed to control it. The story that began in 12th century Provence was never only about two individuals. It was about the hidden spaces where medieval people found choice within obligation, and how those choices quietly shaped the long development of marriage itself.
As Europe moved into the 16th century, the foundations laid during the medieval period did not disappear. Instead, they were tested, challenged, and redefined. The system that had once balanced feudal custom, canon law, and local authority now faced religious fracture on a continental scale. The Protestant Reformation, beginning in 1517 with Martin Luther's public objections to church practices, reshaped Christian Europe. Among its many consequences was a transformation in how marriage was understood. Reformers rejected the Catholic teaching that marriage was a sacrament administered solely under church authority. Instead, they argued that marriage was a social contract governed by Scripture but regulated by civil institutions. This shift did not erase the medieval emphasis on consent. In fact, reformers reinforced it. They insisted that mutual agreement remained essential. However, they transferred oversight from ecclesiastical courts to secular authorities in Protestant territories. Marriage became more directly tied to civic governance. In Catholic regions, the Church responded through the Council of Trent in the mid-16th century. The council tightened marriage regulations even further. It required that marriages be performed before a priest and witnesses to be valid, effectively ending the legal acceptance of purely clandestine unions. What had once been tolerated under medieval canon law was now firmly prohibited. The principle of consent survived, but its expression was controlled more strictly than ever. In France, religious conflict erupted between Catholics and Protestants, culminating in decades of violence known as the French Wars of Religion. Families were divided by faith. Marriage became not only economic alliance, but religious statement. Choosing a spouse could signal political allegiance in a fractured kingdom. For descendants of families like Martin and Isabel's, survival required flexibility once again. Urban professionals often aligned with whichever authority ensured stability. Religious identity shaped household practice, inheritance customs, and social networks. Despite upheaval, one continuity remained clear. Marriage was still central to property, lineage, and social order. Love, when present, operated within these frameworks. The 17th century brought stronger centralized monarchy in France under rulers like Louis XIV. Royal power extended into regions once governed primarily by feudal custom. Bureaucracy expanded dramatically. Record-keeping intensified. Parish registers became standardized. Births, marriages, and deaths were documented carefully. Marriage now functioned within a state increasingly capable of tracking its population. Among the nobility, arranged marriages persisted as strategic alliances. Dowries could involve vast sums. Political marriages shaped diplomacy across Europe. Among merchants and artisans, unions were still guided by trade continuity and financial security. Yet diaries and letters from the 17th century reveal something evolving quietly: personal reflection. Private writings show spouses discussing companionship, household management, and sometimes affection. Emotional expression did not dominate, but it was visible. The Enlightenment of the 18th century further reshaped ideas about individual rights and personal choice. Philosophers debated natural rights, liberty, and the role of government. Marriage came under scrutiny as well. Thinkers questioned forced unions and advocated for greater personal agency. In practice, economic reality continued to influence marriage decisions, but the cultural value placed on individual feeling expanded gradually. The French Revolution at the end of the 18th century marked another decisive transformation. Revolutionary law secularized marriage entirely. Civil marriage replaced exclusive church authority. Divorce became legally possible for a time. Marriage was redefined as a contract between citizens rather than solely a religious sacrament.
This was a dramatic departure from the medieval world, yet it built upon centuries of evolving doctrine about consent and contractual union. Across the Atlantic, in the emerging United States, marriage developed under a combination of English common law and Protestant influence. Consent remained foundational. Civil registration grew gradually. Economic considerations still influenced unions, especially in agrarian communities, but romantic choice increasingly became part of the cultural narrative. By the 19th century, the Industrial Revolution reshaped family life once again. Urbanization separated workplace from home. Wage labor altered household economies. Middle-class ideals began emphasizing companionate marriage, where emotional connection was valued alongside economic stability. The concept that marriage should include love became more widespread in public discourse, though class differences remained significant. Looking back across these centuries, the thread connecting them remains visible. In 12th century Provence, when Martin and Isabel navigated church law to assert mutual consent, they operated within a medieval framework that already recognized personal agreement as the core of marriage. That principle endured every transformation. What changed over time was the balance between business and affection. In the Middle Ages, marriage was primarily an economic and social alliance. Love existed, but it adapted to constraint. It moved through coded rituals, poetry, endurance during crusades, and careful use of ecclesiastical courts. During the Reformation and early modern period, marriage became more regulated and more secularized. Consent remained, but oversight shifted. In the modern era, especially in the United States, the cultural expectations shifted strongly towards romantic love as the foundation of marriage. Yet, even today, economic compatibility, social alignment, and shared stability remain influential factors. The medieval world often appears distant and rigid, but it was never devoid of human agency. People fell in love through proximity at markets and festivals. They expressed attachment through letters and tokens. They used legal systems to defend chosen unions. They endured war, famine, and plague together. Marriage may have been structured as business, but it was lived as partnership. The arc from stone-walled Provence to modern cities illustrates not a sudden invention of love, but a long evolution of how societies balance contract and emotion. Medieval people did not wait for modern freedom to experience attachment. They found ways within their systems. They worked through theology, law, and social custom. They adapted as authorities shifted around them. And in that persistence lies the most surprising truth of all. Love was never absent from the medieval world. It was simply shaped by the realities of land, lineage, survival, and faith. Across centuries of reform, revolution, and industrial change, the core idea remained unchanged from those whispered present-tense vows beneath the chapel roof. Marriage, at its heart, required two voices choosing each other within the structures of their time.
As the story reaches its final stretch, the long journey from medieval Europe to the modern world reveals something consistent beneath every transformation. Marriage systems changed, authorities shifted, economies evolved, and cultures rewrote the language of romance. Yet the human experience inside marriage remained rooted in the same realities: stability, survival, partnership, and choice. In the medieval period, marriage was shaped primarily by land. Land was wealth, and wealth was power. Noble families arranged unions to secure territories. Merchants arranged unions to expand trade networks.
Peasants married to combine labor and ensure household survival. Love existed, but it operated quietly beneath these structures. What made the medieval world surprising was not the absence of love, but the creativity through which people navigated constraints. Festivals created brief openings for interaction. Courtly poetry provided coded expression. Letters carried devotion across distance. Canon law insisted on consent, allowing individuals a narrow but real form of agency. Martin and Isabel's story illustrated this complexity. Their union began in a society where marriage was business, yet it became possible through legal nuance. Their marriage did not destroy the medieval system. Instead, it demonstrated that the system itself contained contradictions. Contracts arranged by families, but consent demanded by the church. Over generations, these contradictions shaped the evolution of marriage. The church tightened regulation after the Fourth Lateran Council. Secret marriages became harder. Public ceremony became the norm. Yet the principle of consent endured. Crusades reshaped love through absence. War reshaped love through loss. Plague reshaped love through mortality. Each crisis forced medieval households to adapt, revealing marriage as more than alliance. It was cooperation under constant uncertainty. By the early modern period, the Reformation and Counter-Reformation redefined marriage authority. Protestant regions secularized oversight. Catholic regions strengthened priestly control. Consent remained central, but clandestine unions were eliminated. State power grew stronger. Bureaucracies expanded. Marriage became recorded, monitored, and increasingly tied to civic identity. In the Enlightenment, thinkers elevated individual rights. In the French Revolution, marriage became civil contract. In the 19th century, industrialization reshaped households, and romantic ideals grew stronger in cultural expectation. By the 20th century, marriage in the United States and much of the West was widely framed as a union based on love. Popular culture reinforced this ideal through film, literature, and advertising. Yet even then, economic compatibility, shared stability, and social context continued influencing marriage decisions. The medieval business model never vanished entirely. It transformed. Modern audiences often imagine medieval people as emotionally distant, bound entirely by duty. Historical evidence suggests otherwise. Court records preserve lovers fighting for promised unions. Letters preserve spouses expressing care. Poems preserve longing. Household accounts preserve partnership in daily labor. Medieval people did not lack love. They lacked modern freedom, and they adapted accordingly. The story of Martin and Isabel, though fictionalized in narrative form, reflects real historical dynamics. Champagne fairs were real. Courtly love traditions were real. Canon law consent doctrine was real. Clandestine marriage cases were real. Inheritance disputes were real. These forces shaped countless lives beyond what chronicles recorded. Their lives illustrate a truth that carries across centuries. Marriage has always been both personal and structural. It has always involved individual bonds within systems of property, faith, and law. In medieval Europe, love survived through patience, strategy, and endurance. It was expressed through partnership rather than spectacle. It existed inside households, managing harvests, raising children, and navigating obligation. The modern world inherited this history. The expectation of marrying for love did not appear suddenly. It grew slowly from centuries of evolving consent doctrine, cultural imagination, and changing economies. When modern Americans think of marriage as a personal choice, they are benefiting from a long historical arc that began far earlier than commonly assumed. The Middle Ages were not an era without romance. They were an era where romance had to coexist with survival. Love did not replace business marriage. It lived alongside it, sometimes hidden, sometimes legal, sometimes quietly transformative. And that is the enduring lesson of medieval love. Even when marriage was mostly business, human beings still formed attachments, still sought companionship, still found ways to choose within constraint. The stone streets of Provence are quieter now. The fairs are gone. The feudal lords have vanished into history. Yet the questions medieval people faced, duty, stability, partnership, and personal choice, remain familiar. Love has always been shaped by the world around it. The medieval world shaped love through contracts and canon law. The modern world shapes love through culture and economy. Across it all, the human impulse persists to find connection inside the structures of the time. And in that persistence, medieval love becomes not distant, but recognizable, a reminder that even in an age dominated by business alliances, the desire to choose one another never fully disappeared.
By the time the medieval world faded fully into the early modern age, the structures that once defined marriage as almost entirely transactional had been reshaped but not erased. The long history of marriage is not a story of business disappearing and love replacing it. It is a story of balance shifting slowly, century by century, as law, economy, religion, and culture changed. In 12th century Champagne, where Martin and Isabel first lived, marriage was a contract written into the logic of feudal survival. Land needed heirs, families needed alliances, women's dowries were financial safeguards, men's marriages were political strategies. The household was the core unit of production, not simply companionship. Yet even then, medieval people were never empty of attachment. They were surrounded by community life, where relationships formed naturally. Markets, fairs, pilgrimages, church gatherings, seasonal festivals. They encountered one another repeatedly, often under supervision, yet familiarity grew. Medieval love was expressed through restraint rather than display. Tokens carried meaning. Poetry encoded devotion. Letters traveled slowly but carried weight. Courtly ideals provided symbolic language, even when marriages remained arranged. The most surprising element was legal. The Church's doctrine that marriage required consent opened a narrow corridor for individual agency. People could, and did, challenge arrangements through ecclesiastical courts. Clandestine marriages were not fantasies. They were real legal cases preserved in archives. Martin and Isabel's union reflected this historical reality. Their marriage was possible not because medieval society was romantic, but because medieval society was complex. Feudal custom and canon law did not always align. In those gaps, individuals sometimes found space to choose. As centuries passed, those gaps were regulated. The Church required bans and public ceremonies. Secret vows were restricted. Marriage became more visible, more controlled, more recorded. Yet consent remained the foundation. Crusades introduced absence into love. War introduced loss. Plague introduced mortality on an unimaginable scale. Each crisis forced households to rebuild.
marriage became partnership in survival. By the 15th century, urban life expanded and literacy spread. Romantic literature circulated beyond courts. Court records show that promises of marriage mattered deeply, enough to be litigated. Emotional expectation gained recognition alongside economic obligation. The Reformation shifted authority. Protestant territories placed marriage under civil oversight. Catholic territories tightened priestly control through Trent. Marriage became increasingly secularized in later revolutions, particularly in France. The modern ideal of marrying for love emerged gradually through these transformations, shaped by Enlightenment ideas, industrialization, and cultural narratives. Yet even in modern America, marriage has never been purely romantic. Economic compatibility, shared stability, family expectations, and social context continue influencing unions. The medieval business logic did not vanish, it adapted. The medieval world, therefore, becomes less alien when viewed honestly. Medieval people were not robotic participants in arranged contracts. They were individuals navigating duty, faith, law, and desire. Their love was quieter, more constrained, but persistent. The story that began in Provence shows that love did not wait for modernity. It existed in coded gestures, in legal claims, in endurance through hardship, and in partnership inside households. Marriage was mostly business, but it was never only business. And that is the historical truth that makes medieval love so compelling for modern audiences. Even in a world built on alliances and property, human beings still sought connection, still formed bonds, and still found ways, however limited, to choose one another within the structures of their time. The Middle Ages were not a romance novel, but they were not loveless. They were a world where love survived through patience, strategy, and resilience. And across centuries, that survival shaped the marriage traditions the modern world inherited. As the narrative reaches its closing depth, the long sweep of history makes one point increasingly clear. Medieval marriage was built on structure, but medieval life was still lived by individuals. Systems may have been designed for land, lineage, and stability, yet inside those systems, people continued forming bonds in ways that were deeply human. In the 12th century, Champagne's fairs connected Europe through commerce. Merchants carried goods, but they also carried ideas, stories, and cultural traditions. Troubadour poetry moved northward, shaping aristocratic imagination. Religious doctrine moved through sermons, shaping moral expectation. Canon law moved through courts, shaping legal possibility. Love in this world was not a separate institution. It was not the official purpose of marriage. It was something that existed alongside duty, sometimes hidden, sometimes acknowledged, sometimes even protected through law. The Church's insistence on consent was one of the most historically significant developments. Medieval people did not invent romantic marriage, but they established the principle that marriage required two voices agreeing. That idea endured through every later transformation. When clandestine marriages created disorder, the Church regulated them, but it did not remove consent from the center. It simply demanded that consent be expressed publicly and recorded. The The medieval period also reveals that love was shaped by community rather than privacy. People did not date in isolation. They met at festivals, in churchyards, at wells, and during shared labor. Attachment grew through repetition and familiarity, not through modern individualist courtship. Partnership was practical. Husbands and wives managed estates, shops, children, harvests, and crises together. Love, when present, often appeared as loyalty, endurance, and cooperation rather than overt emotional display. Crusades separated couples across continents. War disrupted households. Plague shattered communities. These forces made marriage less about idealized romance and more about survival and rebuilding. Yet even under such pressures, affection persisted. Letters show concern. Court cases show commitment. Poems show longing. Medieval love existed, but it wore the clothing of its time: restraint, symbolism, and duty. By the early modern era, religious fracture shifted marriage authority. States expanded control. Revolutions secularized marriage. Industrialization separated home from labor. Romantic ideals rose in cultural prominence. The modern expectation of marrying for love emerged slowly, not suddenly. It was built on centuries of evolving consent doctrine, changing economies, and cultural storytelling. For a modern American audience, medieval love becomes compelling because it reflects continuity. The medieval world may seem distant, yet its people faced recognizable realities: family expectations, economic pressures, social judgment, and the desire for connection. The difference was not that medieval people lacked love, but that they experienced it within stricter frameworks. Martin and Isabel's story, rooted in historical dynamics, demonstrates that even in a society where marriage was mostly business, human choice mattered, consent mattered, partnership mattered, love mattered, even when it could not openly define marriage. The Middle Ages remind us that love is not dependent on modern freedom. It adapts, it survives, it finds space even within obligation. And that endurance is the most surprising truth of medieval marriage. Beneath contracts and dowries, beneath feudal hierarchies and church courts, medieval people remained human, carrying the same impulse toward connection that continues shaping marriage in every era. The world of Provence is gone, but the legacy remains. Marriage today still balances structure and feeling, stability and desire, duty and choice. And the medieval past, far from being loveless, reveals the long roots of the very idea that two people, even within the constraints of their society, could still choose one another. As the final perspective settles over the long medieval arc, what remains most striking is not the distance between that world and ours, but the continuity. Medieval society organized marriage around property, alliance, labor, and inheritance. Yet inside that organization, individuals continued living personal lives shaped by attachment, loyalty, and quiet choice. The Middle Ages were not a single frozen era. They were centuries of change. In the early medieval world, kinship networks and survival shaped unions. In the high medieval world, trade fairs, courtly culture, and canon law introduced new complexity. In the late medieval period, plague, war, and economic shifts transformed household structures. Across all of it, marriage remained central, but love persisted in evolving forms. For nobles, marriage was diplomacy. For merchants, marriage was investment. For peasants, marriage was shared labor. Yet even within these practical frameworks, medieval people experienced attraction, devotion, and partnership. They met at festivals, in marketplaces, during pilgrimages, and under the watchful eye of community life. Romance was not absent, it was simply constrained and coded. Courtly love traditions gave language to longing. Troubadours and trouvères sang of devotion. These songs did not necessarily reflect everyday marriage, but they shaped imagination. They proved that medieval culture was capable of romantic thought, even when marriage remained contractual. The Church, often seen as restrictive, played a paradoxical role. By insisting that consent created marriage, canon law gave individuals a legal foundation for choice. This principle was revolutionary in its long-term impact. Even as the Church later regulated clandestine unions, it preserved consent as the heart of legitimacy. Martin and Isabel's story illustrated this historical truth. Their marriage was not possible because medieval society was modern, but because medieval society contained competing structures. In the spaces between feudal expectation and ecclesiastical doctrine, personal agency could sometimes assert itself. Over generations, those spaces narrowed. Public bans became mandatory. Priests supervised ceremonies. States recorded unions. Marriage became increasingly regulated, yet the core medieval insight endured. Marriage required mutual agreement. Modern marriage ideals, especially in the United States, emphasize romantic love as central. But this ideal emerged slowly. It was shaped by centuries of changing economies, expanding individual rights, cultural storytelling, and legal evolution. Medieval marriage was mostly business, but it laid foundations that eventually allowed personal choice to grow. The medieval world, therefore, offers a reminder. Love does not require perfect freedom. It adapts to constraint. It survives through endurance, partnership, and quiet persistence. Even in stone-walled towns like Provence, beneath contracts and dowries, medieval people still sought connection. They still formed households not only of necessity, but of shared life. They still navigated duty while carrying personal bonds. Marriage was business, but it was lived by humans. And that is why medieval love remains so compelling. It reveals that across centuries, systems change, but the human desire to choose, to bond, and to endure together remains one of history's most persistent forces. As the narrative reaches its final closure, the medieval world stands not as a strange, loveless past, but as the foundation of many ideas that modern audiences recognize. Marriage in the Middle Ages was structured as business, shaped by land, inheritance, and alliance. Yet love was never absent. It simply operated within limits that required patience, symbolism, and strategy. The people of medieval Europe lived in communities where privacy was rare and reputation was constant. Courtship unfolded in public spaces, festivals, churchyards, marketplaces, and pilgrimages. Affection was expressed through small gestures rather than open declaration. Poetry and song carried ideals of devotion even when marriage contracts remained practical. The Church's insistence on consent created one of the most enduring legacies of medieval marriage. Even in a world dominated by family negotiation, canon law declared that marriage required mutual agreement. This principle gave individuals a narrow but real space for choice. Over time, the Church regulated marriage more strictly, but consent remained central. Crusades, wars, famines, and plague tested medieval households repeatedly. Marriage was survival as much as alliance. Couples endured hardship together, managing land, trade, children, and loss. Love in this context often appeared as loyalty and cooperation rather than open emotional expression. Over time, marriage became more regulated, more recorded, and eventually more secular. The Reformation shifted authority. States expanded oversight. Modern romantic ideals grew slowly through cultural and economic change. Yet the medieval foundations remained visible: marriage as contract, marriage as partnership, marriage as consent. For a modern American audience, medieval love is compelling because it reveals continuity. The Middle Ages were not loveless, they were structured. Love did not dominate marriage, but it persisted within it, adapting to the realities of its time. The story that began in Provins demonstrates that even in an age where marriage was mostly business, human beings still sought connection, still formed bonds, and still found ways, through law, custom, endurance, and quiet agency, to choose one another when possible. And that enduring impulse is what links medieval marriage to the modern world. Systems change, economies shift, cultures evolve, but the human desire for partnership remains one of history's most constant forces. At the very end of this long historical journey, the medieval world leaves behind a clear and grounded truth. Marriage in the Middle Ages was rarely designed for romance. It was designed for continuity. Land required heirs. Families required alliances. Communities required stability. Marriage was one of the most important economic and social institutions of medieval life. Yet medieval people were not separated from love. They lived inside systems, but they remained human within those systems. They met through the ordinary rhythms of communal life. They encountered one another at fairs, festivals, churchyards, and seasonal gatherings. Courtship was supervised. Reputations were fragile, but attachment still formed. Love existed in subtle gestures, in tokens, in shared familiarity, and in the endurance of daily partnership. Courtly love literature provided symbolic language for devotion. Songs and romances shaped ideals, even when marriages remained practical. The Church, often viewed only as restrictive, also preserved the principle that consent created marriage. This doctrine gave individuals a legal foundation for choice that would echo across centuries. Crusades, wars, famines, and plague reminded medieval people constantly of mortality. Marriage was not simply alliance, but survival. Couples managed hardship together. Love in this context often appeared as loyalty, cooperation, and resilience rather than open emotional expression. Over time, marriage became more regulated, more recorded, and eventually more secular. The Reformation shifted authority. States expanded oversight. Modern romantic ideals grew slowly through cultural and economic change. Yet the medieval foundations remained visible: marriage as contract, marriage as partnership, marriage as consent. For a modern American audience, medieval love is compelling because it reveals continuity. The Middle Ages were not loveless, they were structured. Love did not dominate marriage, but it persisted within it, adapting to the realities of its time. The story that began in Provence demonstrates that even in an age where marriage was mostly business, human beings still sought connection, still formed bonds, and still found ways, through law, custom, endurance, and quiet agency, to choose one another when possible. And that enduring impulse is what links medieval marriage to the modern world. Systems change, economies shift, cultures evolve, but the human desire for partnership remains one of history's most constant forces. As the final continuation settles into place, the medieval world becomes less like a distant foreign landscape and more like an earlier chapter of the same human story. Marriage in the Middle Ages was built around structure. It was shaped by land, inheritance, labor, and alliance. Most unions were arranged or strongly guided by family necessity. Marriage was business because survival demanded it. Yet even within that framework, medieval people continued to fall in love. They fell in love in the only spaces available to them, in marketplaces where communities gathered, in festivals where social rules loosened briefly, in pilgrimages where shared travel created familiarity, and in churches where public life and religious life blended together. Love did not flourish through private dating, but through repeated contact within communal rhythms. Romance existed, though expressed differently. Courtly poetry and troubadour songs gave language to longing and devotion. These ideals were not always reflected in marriage contracts, but they shaped imagination and cultural expectation. Medieval people understood affection, restraint, loyalty, and desire, even when marriage remained practical. The Church's doctrine of consent remains one of the most surprising historical realities. Medieval canon law insisted that marriage required mutual agreement. This principle gave individuals limited agency inside an otherwise arranged system. Even as the Church later regulated marriage more strictly, consent remained at the core of legitimacy. Crusades, wars, famine, and plague shaped medieval households through constant uncertainty. Marriage became partnership under hardship. Love in this world often appeared not as dramatic expression, but as endurance, cooperation, and shared survival. Across centuries, marriage evolved. Regulation increased. Authority shifted from church courts to state oversight. Modern romantic ideals grew slowly through economic change, Enlightenment thought, revolution, and industrialization. Yet even today, marriage still balances affection with stability, personal choice with social context. The medieval past therefore reveals continuity rather than absence. Medieval people were not loveless, they were constrained. Love adapted to obligation. It survived through quiet persistence inside the structures of its time. The story, rooted in Provence, illustrates that even when marriage was mostly business, human beings still formed bonds, still sought companionship, and still carried the desire to choose one another whenever space allowed. And that is the enduring historical truth. Love is not a modern invention. It is a constant, shaped differently in every era, surviving even in the most structured societies, leaving traces that continue forward into the world we recognize today. At the close of this long sequence, The medieval world remains defined by its structures, but also by its humanity. Marriage in the Middle Ages was primarily an institution of stability. It secured land, ensured heirs, protected households, and reinforced alliances. It was business because medieval society depended on continuity more than personal fulfillment. Yet medieval people still fell in love because love was not separate from life. It existed inside the same spaces where duty existed. They encountered one another through the communal nature of medieval living. Towns were crowded, villages were interconnected, and public gatherings were frequent. Festivals, fairs, pilgrimages, and church life created the few openings where attachment could form. Courtship was monitored, but familiarity still developed. Romantic expression was often indirect. Poetry, song, and symbolic gestures carried meaning in ways that open declaration could not. Courtly love traditions shaped aristocratic ideals, while ordinary people expressed attachment through partnership and shared labor. The church played a complex role. It restricted sexuality and enforced moral discipline, yet it also insisted that consent created marriage. That principle gave individuals a narrow but real form of agency. Over time, the church regulated marriage more strictly, but consent remained at the foundation of legitimacy. Crusades, wars, famine, and plague constantly tested medieval households. Marriage was survival as much as alliance. Love in this context often appeared as loyalty, endurance, and cooperation rather than dramatic romance. Across centuries, marriage became more public, more recorded, and eventually more secular. Modern romantic ideals emerged gradually, shaped by cultural change and expanding individual rights. Yet economic stability and social context remained part of marriage decisions, just as they had been in medieval times. The medieval story therefore becomes recognizable. Marriage was mostly business, but it was lived by human beings who still sought connection. Love persisted within obligation, adapting to law, custom, and circumstance. And that persistence is the most surprising truth of all. Even in a world built on contracts and alliances, medieval people still found ways, quietly, patiently, and within the limits of their society, to choose one another when they could. And that is the enduring historical truth. Love is not a modern invention. It is a constant, shaped differently in every era, surviving even in the most structured societies, leaving traces that continue forward into the world we recognize today. As this final continuation reaches its natural conclusion, the medieval world stands revealed not as an era without love, but as an era where love existed under different rules. Marriage in the Middle Ages was mostly business because society demanded it. Land, inheritance, labor, and alliance were the foundations of survival. Families negotiated unions as practical strategies, and individuals often had limited freedom. Yet within those limits, medieval people still fell in love. They fell in love through proximity rather than privacy. Community life placed people together repeatedly at markets, festivals, church gatherings, and seasonal work. Courtship unfolded under supervision, but attachment formed through familiarity and shared experience. Romantic ideals existed through courtly love traditions, poetry, and song. These cultural forms provided language for devotion, even when marriage contracts remained economic. Ordinary people expressed love less through literature and more through partnership, loyalty, and endurance inside households. The Church's insistence on consent created one of the most important medieval legacies. Even in a world of arranged matches, canon law declared that marriage required mutual agreement. This principle gave individuals a narrow space for choice and shaped the evolution of marriage for centuries afterward. Crusades, war, famine, and plague constantly tested medieval families. Marriage became survival, cooperation, and rebuilding. Love in this world often appeared not as dramatic emotion, but as persistence through hardship. Over time, marriage became more regulated, more public, and eventually more secular. Modern romantic ideals grew slowly through cultural change, revolutions, and industrial transformation. Yet marriage has always balanced feeling with stability, personal choice with social structure. The medieval past therefore offers continuity rather than distance. Medieval people were constrained, but they were not loveless. Love adapted to obligation. It survived through coded gestures, legal nuance, partnership, and quiet resilience. And that is the enduring historical truth. Even when marriage was mostly business, human beings still sought connection, still formed bonds, and still found ways within the structures of their time to choose one another. The stone walls of Provence may belong to history, but the impulse that lived within them remains familiar, linking medieval love to the long story of marriage that continues into the modern world.